Kurt. Hearing is now resumed.
Mr. Commissioner, today we have the second Commercial Perspectives panel. Before we deal with that, I wonder if I might address one remaining question from the evidence in the past few days. The book by Mr. Brown, who testified, Salmon Wars, was not marked as an exhibit, but it was referred to by him in his evidence, as well as through counsel's questions on at least two different occasions. And I've spoken with, in particular, Mr. Harvey, who read from it yesterday. We're open to to your direction, Mr. Commissioner, but we've taken a relatively broad approach to exhibits. It would seem to be consistent with that to have this marked as an exhibit. That introduces a logistical question of having it entered that way. But unless any participant raises a different perspective on it, I'd suggest we simply take that approach.
Yes, I would support Mr. Martland's application, but I would also suggest, because I believe we have it, that the page that I referred to be marked as an exhibit now.
Mr. Lunn has prepared an excerpt from the book that contains the page that was read from, which is pages 134 to 135 of the Salmon Wars book. If the book's going in proper, I don't know if we need the page as a separate exhibit or what the preferable approach is.
I would go with Mr. Harvey's suggestion of marking the page as a separate exhibit and then marking the book first and then marking the page as A of the number that's assigned to the exhibit.
Thank you. And I'll pass up my book to become the exhibit, and we'll work on the logistics of having this circulated.
Mr. Commissioner, I'll mark that now. The book will be marked as exhibit number 497. The excerpts from within the book will be 497A.
Mr. Lowes.
Yeah, Mr. Commissioner, Mr. Brown is off for a very short, well-earned rest, and but I did speak to him yesterday, and this is on the logistics part of it. He's going to be contacting his publisher to see what can be done, because the book hasn't been available for some time. But I will take it on to deal with Mr. Brown and Mr. Martland and make sure that the logistics are dealt with.
Mr. Commissioner, today's panel consists of three people, alphabetically: Bill Duncan, Rob Morley, and Kathy Scarfo. Mr. Morley's testified previously. I take it his affirmation can remain in effect. The other two witnesses, if they could please be affirmed.
You solemnly affirm that the evidence to be given by you to this hearing shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do, yeah. Sorry.
Yes, I do.
You state your name, please.
Kathy Scarfo.
Bill Duncan.
Thank you. Counsel?
We'll move in this order. What I'll try to do is move from left to right and rotate, if you will, who I'm asking the question of first. I will do my best to ensure that the questions I have will be put to all of you, and my approach will be to open the questions up to all of you. I'll ask you not to interrupt or speak directly to a fellow panelist, as opposed to answering my question and addressing the Commissioner through your evidence. As counsel for participants move through their questions, I will ask them to address questions to particular panel members in as much as they can. We do have the challenge of timing for today, and I appreciate that we are looking to do something optimistic, which is cover some rather large topics in a very short period of time. In my questions, I will, I suppose, be Spartan and focus on four main topic areas: allocation, share-based management, or SBM, and the use of ITQs, or individual transferable quotas; third, selective fishing; and fourth, the department's consultative processes, especially the CSAB, Commercial Salmon Advisory Board. I had advised you previously I expected to try to ask some big picture questions. I don't think I'll do that under a freestanding topic area, but you should certainly address that as that arises. My approach will not be to take you to particular documents, but rather to move through this based on the topics and the issues without referring to particular documents. The exception to that is, first, I should just confirm that the Policy and Practice Report, or PPR, is something that is an exhibit and the participants have. Secondly, biographies or CVs for the three of you are the exception to my comment that there are no documents I'm looking to lead. Mr. Morley's CV, Mr. Registrar, I'll just confirm, I believe Mr. Morley's CV is already marked as Exhibit 7 in this proceeding. And secondly, the other two documents are proposed to exhibits are number 68 for Ms. Scarfo and number 70 for Mr. Duncan. Beginning with Ms. Scarfo, number 68 on our exhibit list, Mr. Commissioner, is a biography, a brief biography for Kathy Scarfo, and that's been provided in the witness summary to all participants. I'd ask that please be marked as the next exhibit.
498.
And the next document is Mr. Duncan's biography, number 70 from the exhibit list.
499.
Mr. Duncan, there's one correction to this which I might, if I could address it simply by asking you a question. Partway through that paragraph, there's a sentence that begins, in 1984, he took on the position of director in the Native Affairs branch within DFO. And I think you've identified, but please tell me if I have this right. In 1984, you assumed a position in the Native Affairs branch. It was sometime after that that you served 3 years in an acting director position. Is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you. So that's the one correction I'd make on the record for that biography. What I'd like to do is ask, and I'll begin with Ms. Scarfo, in sort of the 1 minute version, if you could please describe your in your position, your area group and representation and involvement in the commercial salmon fishery.
I'm going to try and keep me short. So I guess just when it comes to the commercial fishing industry, I've been involved for many, many years as a commercial fisherman up and down the coast prior to area licensing and single gear licensing. Since 1996, I've been president of the West Coast Trollers Association and a representative on the advisory for to DFO for that area of troll licenses, which is the west coast of Vancouver Island, where 1,800 vessels used to troll, and we're down to 160 at this point. I was just re-elected to that position in the last 2 months. I also serve on the Canadian Council of Professional Fish Harvesters. I sit on most of DFO's advisory boards representing my fleet, other than the ones where DFO will not allow us a seat. I also participate in the World Fisheries Organization, and I sit on the science panel for NSERC on capture fisheries.
Thank you. Mr. Duncan.
Okay, I mean, essentially, I started fishing as a very young man, and as most Native people do. I started fishing in 1958, which was another big sockeye year, which I don't hear about in this session, but it was a good year. And but I was schooled in a residential school in Alert Bay. I managed to go to university, and shortly after my term in university, I started with what was then the Department of Fisheries and Forestry as a fishery officer. So, and then shortly after that, I got an opportunity to go to Ottawa with Indian Affairs. Spent 6 years there, and then returned to BC with the Public Service Commission of Canada, where I was involved in senior staffing with all government departments in this area type thing. So, And then I returned to fisheries and forestry in 1984 with the Native Affairs branch, and then which then morphed into what is now AFS. So I retired in 1999. I tried to stay retired, but I got enticed to get involved with the Native Brotherhood. Volunteered there for a year plus. Then got elected to a business agent with the Native Brotherhood, and I've been there since 2000. I'm also involved with the Aboriginal Fish and Vessel Owners Association as the Secretary Treasurer. I sit on the BC Salmon Marketing Council as one of their directors. I'm also on the Canadian Council of Professional Fish Harvesters with Kathy. I'm involved in other departmental processes like HIAB, IHHPC, and some other, it just goes on. I'm involved at my own band level at the treaty advisory process. But that's so.
Thank you. Mr. Morley.
I went to university, got a degree in economics at UBC, and started with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in the summer of 1974. Worked there in a variety of positions in the economic analysis side, as well as Director of Planning for the Salmon Enhancement Program and the advisor in international and intergovernmental affairs, working for the last 5 years of my career there on helping to negotiate the Pacific Salmon Treaty with the United States. I left the department in the end of 1986 and spent 10 years working for two trade associations that represented the fish processing industry. One called the Fisheries Council BC, which was and did government relations and lobbying work on their behalf and representation, and the other one being the Fish Processors Bargaining Association, where I was involved with negotiating with the United Fishermen Allied Workers over shore worker contracts and fish prices with fishermen. From there, I moved to took a job with the joint venture between BC Packers and Canadian Fishing Company called Allied Pacific Processors, and was general manager of that company for 3 years. And then since that time period, I have been with the Canadian Fishing Company, and I'm currently vice president in charge of human resources, corporate development, and our production fishing fleet. I have sit on a number of industry boards and bodies, and like probably 15. There's only about 3 of them represented here, but I'm, in addition to the ones you see in there, I'm the president of the Canadian Pacific Sustainable Fisheries Society. I am a member of the again, a number of advisory bodies, both locally and in Ottawa, with other departments as well, so I won't go into those in detail.
Thank you. I'll ask my first substantive question of Mr. Duncan and then move to the rest of you. The question is about the salmon allocation policy from 1999, and the particular, the premise for the question is, of course, the allocation policy sets out a formula for intersectoral allocation. It has an approach that uses a 95 to 5% split, if you will, for sockeye, pink, and chum, as between the commercial and recreational sectors. So with that as one of the main parts of the allocation policy relevant to sockeye, the more general question is, what works and what doesn't work with the allocation policy?
I'm sure DFO is trying to figure that out as we speak, but it's not an easy question. I mean, if anything, the whole problem is the nature of it's a coast-wide allocation policy, but we have a different regime north and south, so. And it's always been a problem to get consensus around those issues, but then it becomes an exercise in crunching numbers, what works. And that's about the extent of that at the end of the day. So,
What do you mean by a number crunching problem or issue?
well, because we're basically not necessarily stuck, but it's 38, 40, 22%, I think, is the allocation between the gear types between gillnet, seine, and troll. And the availability of fish north-south is not necessarily conducive to get those exact numbers. And, I can remember participating, it's been a while now, but where we're trading fish because we're looking at sockeye equivalents. So, and that was the exercise at the end of the day, and we juggled the numbers to fit that exercise.
Mr. Morley, could you offer comments on what works and what doesn't work with the 1999 allocation policy?
Speaking specifically of the intersectoral part of it, between recreational and commercial fisheries, I would suggest that you mentioned the 95% for sockeye, pink, and chum, with 5% going to the recreational sector. I think Bill has touched on a couple of the issues, Mr. Commissioner, and that is, with being a coast-wide policy, the activity for the recreational fishery is really concentrated in a few specific areas. So in Barkley Sound on the west coast of Manuka Island, and largely in the approaches of the Fraser River and in the bar fishery up and around the Chilliwack area is where the vast majority of recreational harvest is located for sockeye. And so the coast-wide allocation is difficult to manage because there really isn't any direct control on the catch of the sport fishery in Barkley Sound, for example. They really get a third of all the fish coming back there, and depending on how many fish are coming back to other parts of the coast, that could go over or under in terms of the coast-wide allocation. But I think if you look over the years, the 95.5 has not been a huge issue. I think the more difficult part is when you look at the other aspects of the policy, and I know Ms. Scarfo will be most interested in the Chinook and Coho priority part, but I think the part that reflects on sockeye is that the recreational priority given for Chinook and Coho is for directed fisheries and a priority to directed access. But the other part of the policy that is that impacts on the sockeye fishery is where, in fact, that priority is only there for directed fisheries, and when in fact the commercial fishery requires a bycatch allowance of Chinook and Coho in order to prosecute and catch the 95% of the sockeye, pink, and chum that it's provided, that is supposed to have a priority. And I think that part of the policy has not been implemented properly at all, so that there have been a large number of fisheries for sockeye. For example, the net fisheries in the Juan de Fuca Strait area, where there is coho bycatch, and we're limited on coho bycatch, but the recreational fishery is actually getting coho bycatch as well. And so if the priority was provided as indicated in the policy, I think there would be opportunities for more commercial fisheries on sockeye, pink, and chum than what have been allocated by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans.
And actually, if you'll bear with me for a minute, before I answer your question, just out of respect to a few people that traveled a fairly long distance to get here today, I'd like to recognize the representatives from House that came down from the Hesquiat Band. We have the chief and his special advisors are here that manage their fishery, and they actually could be out fishing today. So I just wanted to thank them for making the effort of recognizing how important the work of the panel here is. So thank you. You started with a really easy question. What works and what doesn't work? Well, I guess to put that into context, it depends what it is you're trying to achieve. So from the perspective that I'm going to speak from, which is the small independent owner fleet that fishes in the open ocean, which is a mixed stock fishery, not a terminal fishery, not a end of the spawning ground fishery, but the open ocean aggregate mixed stock fishery. What doesn't work is a lack of guiding principles. What doesn't work is a lack of consistent guidelines in allocation. What doesn't work is conflicting priorities. And what doesn't work is a complete lack of direction from government as to what it is that we're trying to achieve, so that we know how to actually make the steps to get there. Now, that being said, there is an awful lot written, and there's been an awful lot of work on allocation that's happened over the years. And some of us have been absolutely amazed and inspired by the brilliance of some of the sharing arrangements and the principles that have come out. And those are identified in things like the FAO Code of Conduct on Fisheries, the guiding principles of selective fishing. All of those things sound great. The Oceans Act, the adjacency principles, those are all things that many of us hold very dear. But when it comes down to where the rubber hits the road, most of those principles are never put into guidelines and principles that actually apply to how we allocate fish, and therefore that's where the biggest pitfall starts. And if you don't address those, the details of how you allocate fish won't work either, which is priority access for recreational fleets, or how you design selective fisheries. All of those won't work unless you actually get to the root of the problem, which is, what is it that you're trying to achieve? Why are we here? Why are we trying to manage fisheries? What's that goal?
I think in Mr. Duncan, in your answer to my first question, you touched on the question of intrasectoral allocation, which is to say within the different gear types or fleets, what works or doesn't work with allocation as it's currently conducted. I'd like to follow up on that and ask that question. I'll begin this time with Mr. Morley and then move to the other witnesses, please.
The intersectoral issue is quite clearly that we have a coast-wide allocation policy that specifies a share of sockeye equivalents for each of the fleets. And we have an area license system that does not allow fleets to participate in more than the area they're licensed for unless they purchase another license. And so there's two problems with that. Number one is that when there's a shortfall in a particular area, in order to make up for it, we allocate more fish to that gear type in another area, but we're actually taking it away from a fleet that hasn't got the opportunity and to move somewhere else. So the coast-wide part of the allocation does not work with the area licensing system. And secondly, the sockeye equivalents work in a perverse way that penalize people like, for example, the area offshore troll fleet that Kathy represents, where if they do a better job in designing a fishery or accessing higher valued markets, their reward is next year they get less fish. And so that those kind of systems do not work under the current way, and we need to find a way to change that into a system that eliminates those problems. And I think the way to do that is through more of a defined share according to fish production area for each of the sectors that are operating in that area, and that would be fixed for all time, and essentially would in fact follow more historic fishing patterns of the local fleets in those areas.
Ms. Scarf, I'm expecting you may agree and disagree with parts of what was just said. Why don't I ask? I'll be coming to the SBM part of this discussion momentarily, but if you could go ahead, please.
So just what was the specific question?
The question had to do with intrasectoral allocation and how that is currently conducted, what's good and bad, and what should happen.
Intrasectoral being the...
as between different gear types.
Okay, you're kind of starting backwards from the way I normally would do it. You set your TAC, you get your share that's going to be harvested, then you need to divvy it up between the top groups. And then once you get down to the commercial sector, you divvy it up. So, but we're going to start with the bottom with you. Historically, we've done a lot of good things in allocation. There's a lot of things that don't work, but if you look back at the 1980s, for example, the biggest thing you heard about fisheries then was the conflict between First Nations and the commercial fleet. And the reason was you had a fully subscribed industry. The commercial harvest, the harvest, the TAC was already fully subscribed, but we were in years of fairly high abundance at that point. So if you look at the problems that have come since then and the conflicts that have arisen and some of the things we're trying to address, you've decreased your abundance. So even if it was just the existing stakeholders that were still in the fishery, you would have conflict because we're going to be fighting over a smaller piece of the pie. The pie's gotten smaller. The commercial share has gotten smaller. Within that commercial share, you've added a significant number of new stakeholders that are also trying to target that same catch. So a lot of the problems around allocation aren't problems that we haven't had to address in the past, but the severity of the problem has increased dramatically because we're arguing over the crumbs at this point. So a lot of the solutions to dealing with allocation are you can continue to say we're going to argue over the crumbs, or we're going to try and increase that pie so that there's actually more fish, less arguments, and a clearer share. There's lots of things, sockeye equivalents as an example. Interesting mechanism when it was designed to develop some kind of sharing arrangements between the sectors, but like Morley says, if I actually increase the value of my product, if I go to lower volume, increase the value of my product, I actually get penalized with less fish. Now there's something significantly wrong with creating a disincentive to adding value. So there's little details within the allocation model. There's the inability to actually define the shares that you have and some sense of security. But then that goes to a broader licensing scheme that doesn't give you that security in the first place because your license is an annual privilege. So you've got some rooted problems, and then you've got some details in the implementation. I've got a list of details in implementation that could be implemented to help address those. But first, I think we need to actually get to the broader picture of what it is that we need to do before we get to that stage.
Why don't you, Carrie, why don't you address that?
Okay. Well, I actually made some notes because I knew I would forget a whole bunch of things. I think one of the biggest things is when we sit down to design allocation plans and allocation models, usually it's within the commercial sector, it's the vested interests that are sitting at the table. So we end up arguing. And there's never any recognition, even though we say we're going to do it, of bringing in the other interests that are actually really large vested interests, which include, say, coastal communities that hold the infrastructure and actually feel the impacts of when you shift fish. Because when you shift fish from one place to another, from one user group to another, there's significant regional impacts to that decision. And at this point, never in any situation has there been a recognition of the impact of those decisions. So if Bill or Ryan or any of us want to make an arrangement within fisheries, we can sit down and make those arrangements in the pre-season plan. But it never goes that next step of saying, okay, we might agree to this. Area B and H, ITQ fisheries, an example of this. They've arbitrarily made a decision that they can shift fish between themselves. But those fish normally would have been harvested, and the benefits of those fish would have been allocated to regions that are now no longer involved in that decision. So the market and the decision-making and allocation then becomes one that is very focused only on certain users when the implications are much broader reaching. So obviously you need a broader consultation process, an allocation policy discussion, not just an allocation once a year meeting where we decide the numbers. You need to clearly identify what it is, the objectives, so that when we make decisions, we know that those are what those are going to be held against, and that there has to be a way of evaluating those at the end of the season and actually prior to actually implementing those. And an example of that is in the United States, they actually do social economic analysis of their fisheries plans to see whether or not those changes make a difference. And I think one of the examples they used down there was where they decided to move a fishery from a region. So that region, the main town in that region, decided not to dredge the harbor that year. Well, the significant impacts of that were an amazing ripple in the economies of that region, not just to the fishery, but to all their other industries. So I think they included that in the actual fish planning process to recognize what fish are for. you need to have some kind of incentive to move from volume fisheries to value fisheries, and right now that's the sockeye equivalent formula doesn't do that. There needs to be a mechanism to recognize that when you allocate fish and you move to selective fishing, there are significantly increased costs in selective fishing. So if you're going to make those conservation sacrifices and incur those costs, there has to be some mechanism to recognize that as part of the value of the formula of that fish. You need to recognize that local knowledge needs to be incorporated in the process. In the past, we had mechanisms, because we have cycle years, for things like catch-up makeup. So you have 1 year where there's large runs. Some people might benefit more than others that year, but there's a way of paying back that additional fish that somebody got so that there isn't economic hardship throughout the fleets. That was removed from the last 1999 allocation policy. I think I'll avoid ITQs at this point. So those are some of the details. I can give you a further list.
No, that's helpful, and I think that'll give, what I'll do now is ask Mr. Duncan between the gear types, but equally if he has any comments arising from Ms. Scarfos. I can tell you, just to forecast a little bit, my next question was going to simply be, what should happen in allocation? What are the particular or specific changes that any of you would recommend? And Ms. Scarfo, I'll allow you a further opportunity to add to that, but I think you've probably anticipated that in some of the points you've made. Mr. Duncan.
I haven't really thought about that per se. So, to a large extent, I agree with Kathy. I mean, there are problems. And there's often problems with the food fish becoming a priority before anything else. But I really can't add much right now because I haven't thought about that in depth. But so
That's fine.
Yeah.
Mr. Morley, the sort of merged question now, if you will, is to comment. I started by asking you about intrasectoral allocation, if I have my notes right on who I've been asking. But you've heard Ms. Scarfo comment on some specific questions that talk about implementation. You're welcome to respond to those points that she's advanced, and more broadly to offer your views on what should happen and any particular changes that should be made to the allocation process.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I think my comments on the allocation process and where it should head, I won't necessarily address what Ms. Scarfo said directly, but I think it'll come to that, is that I have the view that in fisheries management that we already have too many politics involved in fisheries management, and that what I'd really like to see is something that provides a framework and for individual fishing businesses, be they individual owner-operator vessels all the way up to corporate fleets, that can plan on the basis of some certainty and stability, and not have a system which annually requires us to sit down and lobby, negotiate, do analyses, have innumerable meetings to try to change things from year to year. And so from that perspective, in taking all that argument and analysis and politics out of it, I would favor moving to a system that has a defined share of each of the fishery production units that up and down the coast, with initially Fraser Sockeye, for example, being a single production unit, but one could, down the road as we get more sophisticated, look at moving to each of the run timing groups, early Stewart, early summers, and lates, or even beyond that if we get more sophisticated in terms of a production group, that we would specify what each gear type's allocation of that was on a one-time and once and for all basis. And that would then become an allocation table that would be there and everyone could plan around regardless of what happened from year to year. And I think that's the system that would take all this politics out of it and have something that everybody could plot their future in. I won't go beyond that in terms of going to the individual level until we get into those discussions. But
think-
certainly that would, even at that level, provide the opportunity if fleet sectors could look at jointly somehow agreeing between them that they might change that on a given basis. It still provides them that opportunity as a fleet sector to deal with another fleet sector. But initially, it should be fixed once and for all.
I think there's an irresistible pull to us speaking about SBM and ITQ. I think it makes sense that we simply move to that discussion now. Ms. Scarf, I'll begin with you. I would invite you to comment on the big, I'll try and ask one very big question, if you will, or with a few parts to it. Should the commercial salmon fishery move to SBM? Why or why not? And if you can draw on your experience with SBM models, or including demonstration ITQs, if applicable, your experience or observations in answering.
Okay, the big question. SBM. It's an interesting term because it's not one that I was actually familiar with until recently. Defined shares, bandied around. When it comes to identifying shares and sharing arrangements coast-wide on salmon, there is a value to the mechanism that was the sockeye equivalent and the ability to share fish coast-wide. And that was because one of the guiding principles of fisheries and allocating fish that we've heard decade after decade from the fisheries department is stewardship. And that if you felt you had a stake in the resource, then you had a responsibility towards the future. And if that's a value that we still hold, then maintaining some kind of sharing arrangement so that I'm not just interested in the creek and the fish that are actually passing through my neighborhood or my fishery, but that I'm interested in maintaining the stewardship and the vibrancy of all salmon in British Columbia, whether it's in the Skeena and Nass when I'm stuck fishing on the west coast of Vancouver Island. I believe that that's a very valuable tool, and that should transcend just the commercial fishery. That responsibility for all of us that want to harvest fish in BC has to be that we care about all the fish, not just the ones I'm going to maybe catch. Then there needs to be some mechanism that was like the sockeye equivalent that transcends all of those defined shares within those sectors. Now, we don't have a defined share in the commercial industry. The recreational fleet has priority. They need a defined share, and they need to be able to live within that share. The Pierce report in 1983, I think it was, clearly identified that you couldn't have both. You couldn't have an expanding recreational fishery and the same limits because they were going to bump up against each other. Well, they've done that. The recreational fleet now harvests more Chinook on the west coast of Vancouver Island than that dirty, aggressive, fish-killing commercial fleet does. And yet it's not regulated and it's not capped. The commercial fleets we have limited entry, we have capped abilities that we hit up against, and we have to live within those, and we have to learn to be selective. The recreational fleet can just continue to expand. And if there's a conservation problem, someone else pays for it. So the concept of stewardship doesn't even apply in that fishery. So there's a mechanism there that's absolutely critical if that's a principle that we're going to apply. When it comes to share-based management, within area licensing, when the Mifflin Plan came out, I don't know if any of you were in BC, but it was hugely criticized that there was some serious flaws in the policy. One of them was area licensing itself and how you allocate fish that don't just stay in one area. We have Canada-US treaties, we have international treaties on all sorts of stocks that are straddling, and you end up with disputes. It becomes political decisions on how you allocate those fish. You're not going to remove politics from allocating fish. That's where the politics do exist in fisheries. Where politics shouldn't exist is in the day-to-day management and the decision of who's being selective, who gets what funds. Those are the areas you should remove the politics from. But you obviously need the politics and the allocation of fish because it is a Canadian resource, and the Canadian government is going to, on our behalf, make those decisions of who best and how best to allocate those fish. If the Canadian government wants to come out, as they have, and say the recreational fish is more important than my fishery, I can argue against that from my point of view. But it is the Canadian government's responsibility to make that decision, and I will have to live within that. So there are going to be politics. So in fisheries, we get all these cozy statements that really aren't meaningful. You can't remove politics from allocation. We need shares that are clearly defined, but then you need the mechanisms and the guidelines that tell you how, when, and why you're going to change them. Whether it's between First Nations increased participation in the fishery through PIC fee programs or ATP programs, whether you're going to give recreational priority and what the impact of that is going to be on other fisheries and other regions, or whether you're going to concentrate the fishery in the terminal rivers away from the oceans where you get best value, where you have small communities that actually rely on these fish, and put them in the mouth of Vancouver, who really doesn't need the commercial fishery, and in the hands of large corporate interests. And if that decision is going to be made by the license holders themselves through, as Morley models out, this defined share and ITQs, or whether or not we actually say there are political decisions here, and that political decision is that maybe that isn't the best model. It may be the most efficient model for Morley's company, but it may not be what Canada actually wants those fish for, because the added values of having those fish landed in a Housat or somewhere else may be significantly higher. It may not be the model of efficiency that a corporation wants, though. So when you talk about defined shares, you can have some sense of what you're going to get, but you also need the rationale for why those changes are going to be made, and a process that actually shows you how that will be made. At this point, there is no allocation board. There is no allocation table. There is one meeting a year for the commercial industry where we fine-tune things. We have processes like the SCORE or the Kelleher process where we work on those guiding principles together. But we are competing, and area licensing made that competition even stronger. Not only do we compete amongst ourselves as gears, but now we also compete against ourselves as within the gears between areas. And it's like playing a card game that I once learned that was called Screw Your Neighbor. Well, if you put people in the room and you say, here's the card game, what's the outcome going to be? And that's where the politics and the direction is required. I don't know if that answers your question.
It helps me, and I'll try and be a bit more, pick up on one point. I'll frame it as a question to you, and I'll move to the other witnesses in a moment. But on one reading of the record suggests that the department philosophically is inclined or committed to moving towards a share-based management approach for the commercial salmon fishery. Ms. Garfa, what should the department, you can comment on that if you like, what should the department be doing?
Well, when it comes to share-based management, within the sectors, recreational, what's the incentive for me to engage in a selective fishery? I've watched the harvest in my fleet and for my fishermen decrease since 1996, when we reduced the fleet by over 50%. And we reduced it by significantly more than 50% at that point because we went to area licensing and single gear licensing. So the West Coast Troll Fleet went from 1,800 participants to what we are now, which is 160. But the principle behind that was there would be less of us catching the same amount of fish, so we'd be economically viable. But at the same time, they added layer upon layer of other reductions, and Canada, US, I won't engage in, the 50% reduction there. Other than that, even in that principle there, the reduction was only on the commercial troll sector. None of it applied to the other main user group within the area. So the commercial sector needs to know, if we are going to engage in the things that we believe that we need to do, which we are doing in selective fishing, in marketing strategies, in trying to increase the viability working within our region. If we're going to be encouraged to do those things, you do need to know that at the end of this season, I'm not going to lose another 50% of my catch because the recreational fleet went over their share because they don't have any limits. You can't continue to have a business model that has that kind of expropriation and uncertainty. Within the commercial sector, we can fine-tune the mechanisms. We can deal with the sockeye equivalents. But that's not the direction we're going. The only direction when it comes to dealing with the commercial allocation is move to ITQs. It is the savior of all things. And if you don't move to it, we'll just have another process. And we'll just wear you down, where we as participants in the process, who do it unpaid for, and it's hours and hours and hours, and it's expensive because not all of us live in Vancouver. So we end up spending what time we should be doing more productive things, or even being with our families. We end up sitting in hotel rooms in Vancouver, going to meeting after meeting where you know the outcome is going to be one portion of the industry wants ITQs because they need to retire, they need a pension plan, it's the better business model for them. The other portion of the industry still sees that there is a future, that they believe they want to build a fishery that will allow for new entrants, that will be economically viable, not increase the debt load, not concentrate the fishery in areas that are far from the regions that they live in. There's going to be a split. We know that. We go into that process ahead of time knowing that. And we just get to go to another process and another process at our own expense unless we actually agree. And we get manipulated and we get punished if we don't agree with that process. To say that you need, I'm going to keep going because you've opened it up. I've sat here and listened to Jeff Grout. I've sat through the allocation meetings. I've sat through international panels talking about ITQs and the benefits of ITQs. I personally know there are pros and cons to ITQs. It is not one size fits all. The government knows it's not one size fits all. The government knows there are cons to this mechanism. They've recognized them. We have stuff in our exhibits that actually shows that Paul Sprout knows this. He's written about it. The Senate committee has written about it. They've identified these. If you are absolutely determined that ITQs are the only way to go for salmon in BC, then why aren't we engaging in that discussion of how do you minimize the downsides that come with this? Our fishermen in our fleet have categorically told their advisors, their elected representatives, again at a meeting 2 weeks ago, when we asked them again, we're going into another allocation process that the government is forcing us into. We would like to talk about sockeye equivalents and things like that, but we know the discussion is only going to be about ITQs. And so we asked the fishermen, what's your direction? And they basically said, why do you keep asking us? We have told you repeatedly that on principle alone, this is not the solution. It does not slow the fishery down. It does not increase selectivity. It does not increase the value of our product. It will increase our debt load. And if you increase our debt load as independent fishermen right now, I will do what I can to get out there and catch those fish as damn fast as I can so I can get off the water. Because I don't have the ability to incur further debt. We have a fishery that we've modeled. We've presented to the government through selective fishing amendment-style fisheries, which means that we can harvest very small tax, very small amounts of fish, if that is the only allocation there is. If the problem is going over the number, hasn't been a huge problem in our fishery. We've presented and fished to monthly harvest quotas. We took our fishery and we spread it out. We slowed it down. We have a fishery. We've got guys out there fishing today where the average catch right now on the west coast of Vancouver Island is 4 fish. I don't know how much slower you want us to go. We have increased the value of our fish from $2 to $3 a pound to last year $8 a pound. No other ITQ fishery in BC has done that. We land the fish in our local communities. We support the small buyers. We have new entrants coming into our fishery, even with the uncertainty of Canada, US, and the increase in the recreational fishery. We've moved to selective fishing because we believe there is a future with less volume. We need to address the obstacles that are in the way that we've identified throughout these. We spent 5 years developing the winter pilot fishery, where we go head-to-head with farmed fish in the marketplace. We have to haul our fish up the dock because there isn't big enough volume. We put them in totes and bring them up the dock and delivers them in places like Sabalas because there isn't enough volume for the large companies to be interested. We don't sell to the large companies. If you want to look at a model of a fishery that actually works, warts and all, the West Coast Troll fishery is doing those things that DFO says we have to go to ITQ to do. We've done it without ITQ. The problems in our fishery is you keep taking our fish away. You can't have a viable fishery without fish. That's the baseline. Yes, I would like a defined share, but you're not going to define the share because it's going to alter every year. What I want to know is, vis-a-vis the recreational fleet, what my expectation can be for the changes instead of just the ongoing expropriation. We have some stability when it comes to First Nations. We know it'll be a license buyback. The First Nations in our region have expressed interest and have said they will take commercial licenses. They want to enter into the fishery. We have a co-management program within the region with the management boards, with the local community, with First Nations, with NGOs, with secondary industries, with mayors and regional districts. It's a model fishery, being able to stand up to the international scrutiny. And yet, it is the fishery that is under constant attack from DFO to go to ITQs.
I'll take the pause to ask Mr. Duncan to address the question of whether the commercial salmon fishery should move to an SBM or ITQ type of a management model.
I have a fairly simple answer to that, and it's no. It's the Native Brotherhood as an organization is not in support of that. It's I mean, our other aspect of our organization is crew. Those are the guys that work on the seine boats, the extra man on the gill nets and troll and this sort of thing. And the view out there is that you're attempting to squeeze out the little guy. I mean, I can go back, you know, when I started first fishing in 1958. And we fished 4 or 5 days a week. You know, I mean, this was a fairly simple plan. We started mid-June and went to the fall, 4 days a week. It was only in times of conservation where there was a closure. I mean, there used to be what we call 10-day closures, and they were implemented as and when required type thing. But to a large extent, that was the fishery, and then it slowly got chewed away at. Went from 4 days to 3 days, 2 days to 1 day type thing. Now it's 0. But to go back, you know, I mean, a little further, I mean, First Nations have been here for a long time. I know you're going to hear from this, more from this in May, but, you know, we have been here for thousands of years, you know. We've managed to fish for social and economic purposes then. And, you know, I have to support that notion that we're in for the long run here. You know, many remote communities on the coast, I mean, you know, you just can't pick up and go away. A reserve is a reserve. I mean, yeah, some of them have closed down, but to a large extent, they're there. I mean, you have nowhere else to go. And fishing has been a mainstay for many, many years. I mean, it's well documented, you know, in the early days of the Fraser River in the late 1800s. You know, the canners used to employ. They had the license. They employed a lot of Native people type thing. So, but prior to that, yeah, they used to do their own thing. They used to manage. They only took what they needed. And so I just, I'll leave it there. So.
Thank you. Mr. Morley.
And I want to sort of step back a bit and again go to what the purpose of commercial fishing is. We are really talking about catching, harvesting, processing, and marketing a food product into international markets. Okay, this is not about, although it does provide a way of life to a lot of people. Okay, the reality here is that this is an industry that is designed to sell fish to consumers as a food product. And in terms of managing this natural resource on behalf of the people of Canada, it really is the responsibility of the Government of Canada to try to find a way to, in fact, make best use of the resource in a way that can provide the greatest income and employment for Canadians in the business of supplying food products. And I think we really, I want to sort of take away from sort of the emotional attachment to a certain way of life and a way of business, because frankly, that way of life has changed drastically over the last 100 years in all of our businesses and industries throughout Canada and throughout the province. And I don't think we really need to analyze this from the point of view is how do we manage this resource in a way that provides the greatest opportunity to, from a commercial perspective now that we're talking about, to maximize the potential income that is available to Canadians. How we distribute that income we can talk about later. And I think and I want to analyze this from the point of view of the evidence, an evidence-based analysis of share-based management, because it is very easy to get hung up in a lot of rhetoric about what social scientists say the impacts may or may not be based on theory. But I think you have to look at where we have applied this in British Columbia fisheries, in our case, in other fisheries, and seen exactly what the impacts are. And the impacts have been this, that by going to share-based management, we have seen groups take more of a stewardship interest, invest in the resource, invest in science from the commercial sector, develop better management policies that monitor and track the catch better. And we've also seen from a commercial point of view the ability to, in fact, maximize the income that is derived from that resource through targeting higher valued markets and better matching the actual landings to the capacity of the fleet, the processors, and the market to absorb. And the halibut fishery is a prime example of where this has happened. And in fact, contrary to some of the rhetoric here, is that when I worked for the Fisheries Council of British Columbia at the time, which represented the major fish processing companies, we lobbied against implementation of ITQs in the halibut fishery. We were totally opposed because at the time, the major companies were benefiting from an Olympic-style fishery where you had 400 license holders who at one point got down to fishing for no more than 4 or 8 days. When they landed with a huge glut of fish all at once, guess what? The only people they could sell it to, they could unload it to, were the biggest companies with the huge freezing and cold storage capacity, and we got the fish really cheap, okay? We knew that that was going to come to an end when ITQs came in. In fact, it did. And so the individual fisherman now could take his time, could negotiate with a variety of buyers and try to achieve a better market for their fish. And in fact, the major companies that I represented went from handling 80 to 90% of the halibut to probably handling less than 10% of the halibut. So the evidence shows that in fact, individual fishermen have benefited greatly in terms of increased income overall from moving to ITQs. And in the salmon fishery this past year, the best example I can see is that when we did implement a pilot system for areas B and H on Fraser sockeye, and again, I'm not going to speak to what trollers may want to do with Chinook. We're here to talk about managing Fraser sockeye and pink salmon. And with the kinds of markets and volumes we see in that, if we had not had the share-based system for area B and H, I would suggest to you that given the normal style of opening that the department would have come in, we would not have harvested probably we would have harvested maybe 60% of what we did harvest. So because there would have been concern about getting the fleet in the water early on, because putting the whole fleet in there might have exceeded the allowable TAC at the time. In addition, you would have seen that there would have been gluts of fish and processors would not have been able to handle it. They would have said, hold on. and we would have had sporadic openings and not had the opportunity to harvest all the fish. The way it was, from our company's point of view, we were able to spread the landings out over about a 3.5-week period with fish, fresh fish, coming to the dock every day. As a company, we were able to can the lowest percentage of Fraser sockeye that we ever have in our history and achieve the greatest amount going into the fresh and frozen market that permitted us to handle the volume in a way that matched the capacity and target those markets rather than have to deal with poor quality fish with a glut at the dock. So the evidence shows that share-based management does in fact provide the greatest opportunity to maximize the value of the resource to the people of Canada and the incomes that can be derived by providing this food product to hungry people both here and abroad.
I'm looking to move through my topics as well as I can, so I'm going to shift to asking about selective fishing, and my note is that Mr. Duncan is the next person I'll ask first among the three of you. On selective fishing, the question is briefly this. Could you describe your familiarity and involvement with selective fishing? Should selective fishing be more of a priority for the DFO? Are there particular things that you think should happen on selective fishing?
Well, excuse me, my experience with selective fishing initially started when I was in the department. And it was assigned to another person within the region, Gord Curry, and he was the one that took sole ownership of it. At the end of the day, it's when the program ended, I wonder myself, did it have merit? Yeah, there's some practices today that came out of that are still in use today, and that's the revival boxes, railing, this sort of thing. And the knotless bunt, those are the good features that came out of the program, but the actual, for example, allocation of 5% of the TAC to selective fishing, was an example whereby if you were in with someone, you got access to type thing. So, but I wasn't necessarily in favor of that, but that's what happened. But the program has now ceased. It had some merit in some instances, but it's my concern behind this thing is, is the science really there? I don't know. I don't think so. But there's a lot of unanswered questions, about mortality and this sort of thing. But what happens when you take a fish out of the revival tank and throw them overboard? Yeah, I've seen them get revived, but then I think they're more vulnerable to other predation. But in general, I think it's the notion. It was tried and it was concluded. So
I take from that you don't suggest any new initiative or new work on this in particular?
I don't think any more is required. It's the department did try. It's in earnest, and there was a lot of potential, I think, to do a lot of things. But at the time, we were dealing with a dwindling resource as well. There was pressure to do something. There was, behind all of this was the stocks of concern. There was the Thompson cohort, which was the principal guiding force behind this. There was cultus sockeye type thing. I mean, none of these fish had tags on them, so you really couldn't identify them. But if anything, it's as a result of that, coastal coho stocks increased dramatically. So, but I think it's. Is it worth pursuing? I don't think so, but I'm not an expert there. But but what I've seen and what I've read, yeah, no, it's run its course. So,
Mr. Morley, do you have comments on this, please?
Mr. Commissioner, the selective fishing, I think, is a valuable tool to move forward the stocks of concern, and clearly dealing with where you can identify bycatch species is a lot easier to deal with than when we are trying to identify particular populations within a species, which we don't really have technology to deal with at this point in time. I think the real issue here is that we need to find a system that gets the incentives right. I agree with Mr. Duncan that there are still a lot of unanswered scientific questions about what the real full mortality is of fish that are released, that we've seen some studies done in some questionable way to come up with some mortalities that should be relooked at, and we've got some more recent research that shows that there may be longer term effects further up the river of fish that don't make it, that might have survived for the first 24 or 48 hours. Having said that, as I said, the incentives need to be there, and part of the failing of the selective fishing policy is that any individual or group who have seen an advantage in getting access to more fish or more fishing time, whether it be an individual commercial fisherman selected by a scientist to participate on an annual basis, and sure, they want to keep doing it because they're getting to fish when other people aren't, or whether it's a First Nations group in the lower river who are bringing in a new technique that they're getting a special allocation that they wouldn't otherwise get. I would say everyone's going to be in favor of carrying on if they're in that situation. What we need to do is provide the incentives for everybody who is willing to undertake the additional cost and additional care to implement selective fishing to actually be able to get something back for that. And I believe that if we get into a share-based system that has allowable bycatch mortalities, where we measure total bycatch mortality and allocate that as well, that in fact you will find that people will get very inventive and will find new ways in which to fish more selectively within that system that will move us forward. And I think that's really the way we need to go if we want to move forward on this.
Thank you, Ms. Garfo.
Being a commercial fisherman's representative, I'm not sure if I should say this out loud, but I actually love selective fishing. I love the policy, and it suits the type of fishery that I'm engaged in. We select our gear and target the specific species that we want to target and try and avoid the others. Whether you put on a hoochie or a plug or red gear or green gear, or whether you troll at a certain depth or speed. The problem with selective fishing, for all that I love it, and I think it can be an incredibly valuable tool to trying to meet the wild salmon policy, which is another policy that I actually love the thought of, because maintaining biodiversity of all species. In my fishery, we're the aggregate fishery, we're the ocean fishery. If I can have a myriad of healthy little creeks with a ditch behind your house that happens to have 3 coho in it, it adds to that aggregate that I survive on. And it's important because it's all those tiny little creeks added together that make my fishery viable. I love that concept. I love the concept of aggregate, and I love the concept of being able to pick within those which ones I'm targeting. And there's tools that exist within the existing toolbox that we can maximize to do that. In our fishery, we took on a selective fishing strategy even before DFO announced policies. We took on dealing with avoiding coho when we're targeting Chinook, avoiding Chinook and coho while we're targeting sockeye. Time and area management, valuable tool. We micromanage the west coast of Vancouver Island. We DNA sample 25% of our catch to this day. Now that we're not even in the pilot project, we still continue to do that so that we can say the fish returning to this creek at this time of year hug the shoreline. If we move offshore, we can avoid them. So the myriad of tools within that toolbox are much more diverse than actually DFO is giving us benefit of. We looked at different models of how you would give incentives to that. But I think you need to put selective fishing into the context, though, of it will help you maintain biodiversity. But it's not going to address some of the major problems, and we are here to talk about Fraser River sockeye and the declines of Fraser River sockeye. Moving into selective fisheries will make a very small difference on the health and reoccurrence of building reproductive Fraser River sockeye runs. Selective fishing is one of the tools for commercial fishery to access fish around those runs, but it will not rebuild Fraser River sockeye. So I think you need to keep that in mind, that when we talk about the importance of selective fishing, it is not a rebuilding mechanism. It is a tool for harvesting. And if we focus too much attention on selective fishing as the be-all and end-all of how we deal with fisheries, we are dealing with the symptoms rather than the causes. And so I would say, from the Cohen Commission point of view, if the Cohen Commission is to be looking at that, the goal is that we're not going to stay in the situation we are now, because we didn't need a commission to do that. The goal is not to stay on the track that we were, because we would have done that anyway, and we didn't need to sit in here to do that. If the goal is to actually see vibrant Fraser River fish into the future, not like 2009, but more like we can see we can do in 2010, then selective fishing mechanisms should be encouraged. There should be incentives, but they should be recognized as just one tool in that toolbox for harvesters to avoid the weaker stocks, the less productive stocks, and fish around them. But then you need to be really clear that within the wild salmon policy, the cutbacks on incidental catch or bycatch of weaker stocks needs to be viewed from the actual benefit of cutting fishing and the actual, therefore, benefit of selective fishing. If foregoing 25 million Fraser River sockeye to protect 200 cultus is actually effective, then that's a cost-benefit analysis that we need to do, and we need to recognize that. We need to be able to say, we as the Canadian government gave up 25 million sockeye, worth however much they are, because we want to protect these 200. But the general public should then also be able to say, was that really effective? Did cutting back the commercial fishery actually really do anything for cultus? Or would we be in a better situation to harvest 25 million sockeye, maintain an exploitation rate that does not do incredible harm or irreversible harm to that stock group, and actually invest the money in where the actual problem is? And if it's pike minnow, if it's dams, if it's irrigation, if it's agriculture, if you don't address those, you will constantly be cutting commercial fisheries back, because there will always be a weak stock in that mix, because you're not actually doing what it is you're supposed to be doing to protect those weaker stocks, to rebuild the mix and the aggregate, to provide the commercial fisheries that produce the interest in Canada to maintaining wild salmon in BC, and increase the economic benefits and actually put the money. And I know Dennis Brown put a suggestion on the table yesterday that I was kind of surprised at, and that was a royalty. And I, like Dennis, have always felt that the person that causes the problem should be the person that pays the price. And in most of our situations in the commercial fishery, that is not the situation. Commercial fishermen are constantly viewed as the culprit. From a proud tradition of being a commercial fisherman, most of the commercial fishermen I know are actually feel like they are targeted as the problem even though in many cases, in most cases, it is not overfishing that caused the problem. And even if it was, commercial fishermen do not define the TAC. They fish within the TAC and normally stay within that set TAC. So if the government is issuing overly high exploitation rates, allowing too much fish to be caught, the culprit becomes the fisherman. But the problem is, when Dennis put forward the suggestion of paying a royalty, my immediate reaction was, but I didn't create the problem. I didn't ruin that stream, that river, that creek. And we have constantly tried within the commercial industry to use the Fisheries Act as much as possible to stop. I mean, we've taken cases to court for oil spills and chemical spills in the Fraser River for dredging. We end up being the group that tries to stop, whether it's a dam or whatever, from happening. We don't have the tools, we don't have the budgets. The Fisheries Act is there. The federal government is not using the Fisheries Act to its ability. And so when Dennis suggested a royalty, my first reaction was, no, we shouldn't do that. Because then you let the actual culprit off the hook. Thinking about it at 2 o'clock this morning, I had to say I changed my mind. As long as that royalty could be held by fishermen and controlled by fishermen and didn't go into that big black hole of general revenues. If fishermen, like we did on Cultus, can take $1 million of their fish or of our revenue and actually address the problem, and actually for $200,000 or $1 million get really good bang for our buck, then why shouldn't we do that? Why shouldn't we put the money where it actually makes a difference if it means we can harvest 25 million fish? But to do that, then you also need some sense of security that somebody else isn't going to harvest those fish in priority of you, that you have some, maybe not a defined share in the ITQ sense of it, but some assurance that you are still in line in that picture, that you're investing in your future, not somebody else's future, and that you control those funds, and that you still have the ability then to go after the individuals that are causing the problem. So I have to say I changed my mind on what Dennis was suggesting, and I think even within the wild salmon policy, which is not a policy that says we have to harvest fish on the spawning ground. It is that we maintain the biodiversity. Are we up to those challenges? I think we are. I may be proven wrong 20 years from now. It may be that we end up continually shutting fisheries down, but I believe in giving people the opportunity to step up to the plate. And in Area G on the West Coast, we stepped up to the plate and we micromanaged our fishery. We made the investment. We've used and gone creative and found additional tools above and beyond ITQs, which in my mind is a faulty solution that, if implemented, is irreversible. So to look at opening up possibilities to meet those objectives, to me the ITQ, I'll disagree. It may work for some people. It may work for the efficiency model within a corporation. In my view, it doesn't do the things that it says. Most of the reports that have been written about ITQs have not asked the individual fishermen who've been displaced from that fishery. It asks those that benefited, how well is this working for you? Ask the black cod fleet how well they're doing. The guys that are still there are doing quite fine. Ask the halibut fleet who had a windfall of quota. But then ask the fishermen that were displaced because the management costs were too high, or they didn't have large enough landings, that now are looking at, through treaty settlements, $1 million to get back where they used to be. Where 70% of the landed value is in lease rents, instead of going into putting that investment into things like Cultus. I would rather see that go into a royalty than into rent for somebody who's sitting in some office building or some foreign nation and reaping the benefits of that.
We will now recess for 15 minutes.
PM